Smoking is the leading cause of preventable disease, disability, and death in the United States. A new approach to tobacco regulation, which involves banning the sale of nicotine products to anyone born after a certain date, could hold promise. I'm Stephen Morrissey, managing editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, and I'm talking with Katharine Silbaugh, a professor at the Boston University School of Law. Professor Silbaugh has co-authored a perspective article about a so-called tobacco-free generation bylaw passed by the town of Brookline, Massachusetts. Professor Silbaugh, what's the general idea behind tobacco-free generation policies?
The basic idea is that you have a birth date based access or sale regulation with respect to tobacco rather than an age based law. So you continue sales to existing users, but you stop sales in perpetuity to those who are born after a birth date that is chosen based on those who are not yet old enough to legally purchase nicotine products when the law was passed. So the basic idea is that it's a humane policy of transition. So it phases out the sale of nicotine products to today's youth while it still preserves access for those who became dependent on nicotine prior to the law's passage.
In your perspective article, you describe a tobacco-free generation bylaw that was adopted in Brookline, a bylaw that you co-sponsored. What's that particular policy entail?
So the policy in Brookline has adopted a birth date of January 1st, 2000. And what that means is that anyone born after January 1st of 2000 will never be able to purchase tobacco or nicotine products in Brookline, meaning that if you sell nicotine products in Brookline, you're prohibited from selling to anyone born after that birth date. Whereas an age-based restriction, you would be aging into appropriate use of nicotine at age 21. This idea is that there is never a safe age to be using nicotine, but the reason that it's still available for sale is because people are dependent on it. So the Brookline law applies to Brookline retailers and sets the date at January 1st, 2000. But somebody who adopted the law now might set the date at 2004, for example.
So those retailers in Brookline then sued the town over the bylaw. On what grounds did they challenge it?
They had two grounds. One is a statutory ground under the Massachusetts Tobacco Act, and another was a constitutional challenge. So the Massachusetts Tobacco Act makes it illegal to sell tobacco products to anyone under 21 years of age. And the retailers argued that this was a statewide law that preempted the ability to have anything that looked like a higher age. It isn't exactly an age-based restriction. It is a birth date restriction, but it looks to the retailers like an ever advancing age. And so they said the Massachusetts Tobacco Act prevented localities from acting, but the unanimous Supreme Court of Massachusetts decision said that the Brookline bylaw was actually not addressing the 21 restriction, and it kept it in place. And that act had really expressly kept a role for cities and towns in regulating tobacco more strictly than the state did. And so the statutory challenge was rejected. The constitutional challenge was based on the idea that if you distinguish between people based on age and they're no longer minors, you have something like an irrational law. But the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court also rejected this challenge unanimously because they said it was rationally related to the goal of reducing tobacco use and promoting public health.
And then what's the response to the policy been in Brookline, including among the young people who are covered under the sales ban?
The sales ban has been working in Brookline. I would say that it was adopted during the pandemic, and public health information and data is a little bit bent by the pandemic because youth were at home so much more. So we don't know for certain what the outcome is yet. We don't have any data in one direction or another. It's also the case that when one locality adopts something like this, and it's a small town geographically, it has less impact than if it's adopted by a number of localities. But fortunately, since the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court gave a green light to this kind of regulation, 3 other localities have already adopted it: Stoneham, Wakefield, and Melrose. And a handful of others are looking to adopt it this spring. So I would say some by the end of this month. So the efficacy of this as a method of phasing out tobacco sales increases the more jurisdictions who adopt it. And that SJC ruling really opened that door, and we're seeing some forward motion.
So finally, as you say, Brookline's law by itself will have limited effect on public health since people can go to other towns to buy tobacco products. What then do you see as the potential implications of the town's policy more broadly?
I think that the tobacco-free generation policy, the birth date phase-out idea, is gaining some traction, even globally. In the UK, a TFG bill cleared a major hurdle in Parliament recently when a first reading of it gained an enormous amount of support in Parliament. New Zealand had passed such a law in 2022, and of course, they're an island, as is the UK. The New Zealand law was repealed when they had a subsequent change in government. So if you see the Brookline law as a model showing that the law is legal, and showing that it can work and that it has a slow and minimal impact on retailers because it's also a phase out for them, that we might see a broader adoption of the policy. And it is one in a toolkit of ways for public health regulators to address the substantial risks from tobacco and nicotine. It's only one way, but it is a way that we think is particularly compassionate to people who feel dependent on nicotine, while it also prevents the next generation from joining the decades and decades of people who have found themselves dependent on it and unable to quit.
Thank you, Professor Silbaugh.